Hello my fellow masters, welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great Player. My name is Guy and today we are going back to basics. We are quite literally going all the way back to character creation. Now on this channel there are multitudinous videos on how to create a character, and if you head on over to Bacon RPG, the links are below, you will find even more videos on character creation. So what could I possibly be talking about when I say we're going back to basics? Well, firstly, this video will be on character creation within a Dungeons and Dragons environment. Why Dungeons and Dragons? Well, it is by far and away the most well-known of the systems, and its character creation process is fairly robust, from a beginner's perspective anyway. Now, that's not to say that if you're a seasoned role player, you won't find anything valuable in this video. This video looks at creating characters in a different way to how I've looked at it before on this channel. This is a quick and easy way so that you can get straight into role-playing without getting bogged down with the minutiae of character creation that can sometimes seem to be very overwhelming. So very basically, we're going to look at the concept behind your character, how to come up with that concept in the first place. We're going to look at how to develop that character, if I get out of the way, how to develop that character. We're going to look at stats for that character, and then we're going to look at how to breathe life into that character. Those for me are the four most important elements when it comes to character creation, and so that's what we're going to look at. So let's go straight through to concept. Hopefully it'll work. Let's see. Nope, it says there we go. Right, now it's working all of a sudden. Okay, so in concept we need to look at a few things. And how do you come up with the character in the first place? Well, we need three things. Now what are these things? Firstly, I advocate you need a name. So absolutely come up with a name. Oftentimes people leave the name for last. And the reason why I say that you should come up with it first is because when we name things, we give them a life, we give them status, we create a value. That's why at the moment a child is born, we try and have a name ready for it so that it doesn't grow up for the first 10 years being called thing, it, the baby, the thing. We name stuff to give it value and to give it purpose, and names have so much meaning to us that it's important to have it straight away. If I were to throw out a name Bob, what do you think of when you think of Bob? I think of a man in a blue corset because, well, that's the Bob that I know. Other people might think of Bob in a different way. If I say Vanderash the Black, well, now it's something completely different. If I say Ulcatria the last of her kind, well, that's something completely different as well. So a name is so important. I think a name is really important when coming up with a character. So come up with the name first. Now, if you're uncertain as to what you're going to be playing, if you're uncertain as to the race that you're going to be playing, if you're uncertain as to the campaign you're going to be playing in, coming up with the name first just makes sense. A name tells you a lot about a person, even if it might not be true. But that's what we are doing, is we're creating a person. So having a starting point like a name is an incredibly great place to begin. So that's the first thing that we need, one of the three things. The other of the three things that we need to come up with is a location. Now, when I mean location, I don't mean you need to go running off to the map and find a location. I mean we need an urban, a rural, a wilderness, frigid, a random generic location. Why do we need that? Because that is where our character, Vanderash the Black, that's stuck. Why Vanderash the Black? And we're going to have the location of, let's say, open plains. All right, Vanderash the Black, open plains. And then the last thing that we need, of the original three things, the last thing that we need is we need an occupation. So Vanderash the Black, before Vanderash became the Black, the Dark Force, the Nemesis, the Evil One, what was Vanderash doing out in the Great Plains? Could that have been surviving in a farm-style community? Could they have been a hunter-gatherer? Could they have been a nomad? Could they have been a hermit? it doesn't really matter at this point in time, and you're going to see as this whole video unfolds that these are just stepping stones that we need to have in place before we can start on our journey of creating the character. So let's say Van der Esch the Black lived out in the Great Plains and was studying to become a blacksmith. Again, don't go into too much detail. Don't go into was studying to become the world's greatest sorcerer. We don't know what Van der Esch the Black is yet. They might not be a sorcerer. They might be a sorcerer. I don't know. But we haven't got there yet. So let's say that they were studying to become a blacksmith. Now we need 3 cool things. What are cool things? Cool things could be anything. Could it be a dog? A dog is a cool thing. And if you don't think dogs are cool things, well, I'm sorry, I think you're missing out. Dogs are amazing. They're always happy when you come home, they're always excited to see you, and they're always willing to be around in your space. So dogs are amazing. So Van der Esch the Black, who lives out in the plains and is a blacksmith, or as an apprentice blacksmith, has a dog. Cool thing number 1. Cool thing number 2 is, let's say they have a flute carved out of the bone of an elephant, whether it's a mammoth or a woolly elephant or a mastodon or a Javanese miniature pygmy element. It doesn't matter. They have a flute made out of a bone of an elephant. And then the third thing, let's say, is that they have they know of this little waterfall that nobody else knows about, and behind the waterfall is a little cave, and inside that cave is where they go to hide when they're lonely. So it's 3 cool things. It's 3 things that anyone who lives out on the plains and is studying to become an apprentice blacksmith would like. Where am I coming up with this stuff from? Where is this coming up from? Well, it's coming up from my imagination. And I have done quite an extensive video on how to improve your imagination, or how to develop it anyway. And it helps in terms of research. Go watch the video if you want to work on that one. So we've got 3 cool things: bone flute, a hidden cave behind a waterfall, and of course a dog for this apprentice blacksmith who lives out in the plains named Van der Esch the Black. Now, 3 references. What are things that come to mind when we talk about someone like this? If you can't get 3, that's okay. 1 or 2 references would be great. But the very first thing that you could do is you could jump onto Google or whatever search engine you happen to choose and type in, say, apprentice blacksmith, or type in cave waterfall, and just bring up images and just fill your mind with images that relate to the 3 things that you've listed, or to the 3 cool things that you have listed. Just bring up references so that you can look at them and you can get inspired by them and you can build ideas from them, or just use them directly. So that's the first idea. So we're going to come up with this concept. So we've got Van der Esch the Black, who grew up in the Great Plains and was an apprentice blacksmith. He had a dog. The dog's name was, we'll get there, and a flute made from the bone of an elephant, as well as a secret hiding space behind a waterfall. And we've got some images that will help support us and encourage us in that. So once we've got our concept, we can now develop the story. Now, in terms of creating the backstory for Van der Esch the Black, who lives on the plains and is an apprentice blacksmith and has a dog and a flute, as well as a secret hiding hole behind a waterfall, that's not so much a backstory as that's some items. Now we link it together in a backstory. We need to start gluing that together. So what is an interesting narrative for Van der Esch the Black, and why specifically, this is the most important part, why did Van der Esch the Black from the plains, who was an apprentice blacksmith, why did they start adventuring? Now, this is the key question which so many people forget to answer, or forget to have an answer for. You've created this fantastic character, but without the motivation for them to go adventuring, there's really no reason for that character to be there. And that takes away almost 90% of the entire purpose of role-playing. It is to go on fantastic adventures. If you look at The Hobbit, for example, Bilbo Baggins did not want to go on an adventure to begin with. He refused and tried to turn away everyone who tried to take him on an adventure, until eventually he realized that he needed to go on it for himself, to become a better hobbit, to move away from the mold that he'd been in. That was a great motivation, and he went on a great adventure. So you need to decide what caused Van der Esch the Black to leave the plains. Now, the way you do that is you write a simple story. Vanderash the Black left life as an apprentice blacksmith on the Great Plains, left it all behind because he was bored of the village he grew up in. He wanted to see the world. He had a girlfriend who broke up with him and shacked up with his best friend. His parents all burned to death in a fire. I roll my eyes at that last one because so many people create backstories of characters who have these tragic pasts because they feel that that is the need for a change. That's what's going to motivate change. Change can happen in very small ways as well. Perhaps the blacksmith he was working for died of a heart attack, and so the smithy closed down, or a new blacksmith arrived in town and didn't want an apprentice, so he was expelled from his apprenticeship. Whatever the reasons might be, you just need to write it out in a simple sentence. Now, how do we take it and we make it more interesting? Well, this is an exercise that I ran with the guys on Discord, and they loved it and helped find value for their characters. What you do is you take your simple story. Let's fix on the idea that he was discharged as being the apprentice to the blacksmith because the new blacksmith arrived with his own apprentice. So Vanderash the Black left the Great Plains and his life as an apprentice blacksmith because he was no longer needed. And without much prospects for earning other cash or other money, he had to leave. He took his dog along with him and his magic flute, or his flute is not magical, took his flute along and said goodbye to his secret hidey hole. Or maybe he stays in his secret hidey hole and he ventures out from that. That's okay. What we now do is we take that story and we rephrase it as a horror. As a horror story. So now, perhaps our hero leaves because when the new blacksmith arrived, he chained him up in the basement and started to torture him, trying out different heating techniques of metal and burning it on his flesh. And only once he managed to escape from that terrible dark dungeon did he flee out into the wilderness to go and seek solace in his cave, and has vowed to return one day and enact revenge upon that blacksmith, for the blacksmith is totally, totally evil. That's a bit horrific that he was tortured by the man who replaced the original blacksmith who died. That's rather horrid. So that's horrific. Now, what if it was a comedy? So how do we rewrite that if it's a comedy? Vanderash the Black, who was an apprentice blacksmith, woke up one morning to find that he was no longer an apprentice or a blacksmith. He'd been fired because he'd been replaced by a girl who had arrived as the apprentice to another master. Things wouldn't have been too bad if his dog hadn't stolen the new master's main battle hammer, maiden hammer, whatever you want to call it, forge hammer. The dog ran off, and so now Vanquish the Black has been forced to leave town to retrieve the hammer before he can even contemplate starting his new life. It's not very funny, but I'm making this up on the fly. Give me a break. The idea is that you write it as a horror, then you rewrite it as a comedy, and then you rewrite it as a drama. How would we play this out as a drama? Vanquish the Black, down to his last few brass copper pieces, brass farthings is what I wanted to say, and then I realized we use copper in Dungeons & Dragons, down to his last few coppers. Desperate to win the approval of his father, who is the local blacksmith, and who has discharged him recently for failure to live up to his father's standards, has replaced him, and so now Vanquish the Black must now journey out into the world to try and win the approval of his father and get back to being a blacksmith. So that's a bit of a drama. So now we look at the three of them, and we say, okay, so the torturing idea is pretty cool, it's very dark. The comedy idea of the dog stealing the forge hammer, I think, is also kind of cool. The drama about the father approval is great. Now, I'm not advocating this, but in this case, we could combine all three together. The dog stole the forge hammer. Vanquish the Black lost the approval of his father because the forge hammer had been lost and everyone suspected Vanquish of doing it. And the blacksmith, who is currently now without a forge hammer, tortured Vanquish to try and find out if Vandish had stolen the hammer out of spite. Only once Vandish escaped could he then turn back and say, well, now I have to go and get the forge hammer to prove my innocence, because I've now fled away from that blacksmith. So we could combine them all together. But you might find one or two that, quite frankly, work better. And you can combine them and you can keep them separate. It's entirely up to you. But what you've now done is you've workshopped through different alternatives. You don't have to just do horror, comedy, or drama. You could do horror, you could do romance, you could do war, you could do thriller, you could do science fiction, although how that would link into Dungeons and Dragons, I don't know. But you could work through any sort of genre if you like. But by rewriting that backstory, you are looking at alternatives. You are discovering, you are exploring. But notice, throughout this entire exercise, we have kept Vandish the Black, the apprentice blacksmith, the dog, the Great Plains, all of it has managed to be kept. And it feels like a much more engaging story because we have a character name. So now once we've done development, now we move on to statistics. So now we build on the story. So Vandish the Black is an apprentice blacksmith. That means that they are probably going to have a fairly decent strength. Now, I know that most Dungeons and Dragons, when you're creating a character, it's either a dice roll or it's a point buy, depending on what sort of system you use. Generally speaking, you have control over where those statistics go. This is also not the way to build the perfect class, the min-max type of class. If that's your game, that's a different story, and I'll do another video on that if you want me to. Let me know in the comments below on how you min-max whilst at the same time creating an awesome story. What we are doing now is we're trying to create an awesome character that is supported by the statistics within the D&D situation. So within Dungeons and Dragons, you can assign your scores as you like, as you want. So with this young blacksmith, I would assign perhaps a 13 or a 14, if possible, to strength. That's really where we are locked in terms of our narrative, supporting our story. Now, if he's got a dog, that means he might be good at animal handling. He might have a fairly decent wisdom, because he's good with animals. Or maybe he has a fairly good charisma. If you've gone with a story where the character was maybe not liked by his father, maybe his charisma should be lower. Perhaps it should be one of his lowest stats. I don't think intelligence features in there anywhere, except perhaps maybe he decides that he doesn't want to be a blacksmith anymore and he wants to study on the arcane, although at no point in any of those narratives did we include arcane in there. So I would say intelligence could possibly be average. Constitution-wise, well, he manages to stay in a damp cave on the Great Plains for a long time, so maybe his constitution is pretty good. Dexterity, again, possibly it could be a high stat, but for me, what immediately speaks is the strength statistic and the something to do with animal handling, survival. I'm kind of getting that vibe from the Great Plains kind of environment, from the watery cave, from the flute made out of bone. Is he a bard? Has he taken up the bardic mantle? There's nothing wrong with that. Certainly the charisma side of things could be supported in terms of he's good with animals and with people. It was just bad luck that kicked him out. So that's something to look at. So far, when we look at the statistics, he should have good strength, okay dex, okay constitution, okay intelligence, above average wisdom, and either above average or average charisma. Somewhere in that ballpark. And with point buy, you usually get that distribution happening as well. If anything, we didn't mention anything about his intelligence, so maybe his intelligence is not so high. We didn't mention anything about his dexterity, so maybe his dexterity is not so high, and that's why he got kicked out of being an apprentice blacksmith, depending on the narrative that you've gone with. We then turn to our class. Now, when we're looking at something that's got good strength, that's got relatively good constitution, and it has fairly decent wisma, which is wisdom and charisma combined, wisdom or charisma, well, we're now looking at something like, what, a bard, a barbarian, a straight-up fighter, perhaps something like that. Certainly with the blacksmithing background, wielding a large hammer, the forge hammer that was stolen by the dog, which eventually he will retrieve. Perhaps it could have something along those lines. Or perhaps we leave the dog and the forge hammer in the hands of the GM and they can worry about it. Because it is something that's interesting. We do want that dog back, but remember we're creating our character. So let's leave that up to the GM. So a barbarian blacksmith, that could work. Or just a straight up fighter who uses maces and mauls. That's pretty interesting, I think. Especially one who's trying to win the approval of others. That certainly could work. Otherwise, we do have that bone flute. So what we are going to do is we're going to make sure that whatever background we choose, because that gives us some skills, is going to give us the performance skill. So that we can use that bone flute as and when, maybe during camping sessions, when it's around a campfire, anything to help flesh out the character. So do you see now how, having slowly worked through this process, we're starting to get a character who plays the flute even though they might be a maul-wielding warrior. So they're this real tough guy, and they play the flute around the fireplace. I think that's a very interesting character. We then look at the equipment that they would have. Do they have anything? Well, they've got the flute, absolutely. They've probably got some kind of hammer that might be very well their weapon, or it could just be a throwback that they happen to have this from their forged days, if they've gone more bard sort of roots and things. So we can now sort of flesh out that as well. Of course, the backstory, the background that you choose from the player's handbook will of course dictate something along those lines. Now the player's handbook of course has a limited range of backgrounds, and of course every subsequent additional book that D&D has released has got more backgrounds, but you can also create your own background. Remember to do that though in conjunction with the dungeon master, so that you can make sure that it aligns with their world and is also fair. But there's very, very strict rules in terms of how to create a background for that. And I think most DMs would welcome it, especially if you stick within those rules. So now we've got our class, we've got our character, we've got all of our stats. We've basically got everything except for these last three things, which are very, very simple to come up with, and they will breathe life into that character. So we've got Vandish the Black. I think his name's changed throughout the video. I didn't write it down. We've got Vandish the Black. And Vandish, what are his goals? What are Vandish the Black's goals? It could be to retrieve the forge hammer. It could be to impress his father. It could be to complete his blacksmith qualification. Now, bear in mind, goals are something that the character wants to achieve. That doesn't mean that the character is actually going to achieve it. So although you might say the goal of Vandish the Black is to become a blacksmith, when presented with the opportunity of settling down and becoming a blacksmith, Vandish the Black is not going to do that. They're going to realize that, hopefully, after a couple adventures, is not actually the life that they seek. The idea of settling down and working in a smithy day in and day out is just actually not that appealing. Not now that the world has opened up in front of them. Does that mean that the goal has been accomplished? Yes. But does that mean that there are no more goals? Absolutely not. Now you're going to try and create new goals for Vandish the Black. Perhaps it's to retrieve that forge hammer. Maybe that's the ultimate goal of the character. And once they have that forge hammer, to return back to that little village in the Great Plains next to the waterfall with the secret grotto, and to present it to the blacksmith and win the approval of the father. Of course, once that's achieved, the character journey has come to a conclusion, the character's main story has come to a conclusion, and then we start to look for more, we start to develop more. But that's a whole nother story and multiple adventures later, depending on how long you and your DM play that out for. So goals. Come up with some goals. Try and find some goals, create some goals, imagine some goals that character might have. You then need to look at the attitude of Vandish the Black. Now, what is the attitude of a blacksmith? Again, I'm using stereotypes, a little bit of my own knowledge of people who generally become blacksmiths, and the idea that I have of blacksmiths are people who are incredibly patient, people who are incredibly hardworking, people who are not afraid to get hot whilst working. And that all speaks to a very determined, very focused mind. A steel mind, if you will excuse the unintended pun. So Vandish the Black, I think, is an incredibly serious and incredibly focused person, at least certainly when they're setting about a task. But their attitude when they're at leisure, I think they're not isolatory, because we don't like to create characters that are on their own, but I think that they like to retreat to a quiet space where they can hear running water, and that calms them down. Again, this is just based on the backstory that we created earlier on. So that's how I would play them, is when there is a task at hand, they are incredibly focused. They're incredibly dedicated to completing that task. But when they're in downtime, they relax. They like to choose a campsite nearer the river rather than further away from it. They like to stretch out and create a little bubble with their music. What are their values? Now, in Dungeons & Dragons, over its many iterations, alignment has come into play a lot and has changed and evolved and grown. Values are similar to alignments, but they're not as rigidly defined, because the value is, how does Vandish handle innocent people? Is Vandish someone who's going to steal? Will they return something that's being lost? Well, I think the answer to that is yes. Since the dog stole the forge hammer and Vandish left the village to go and get it back, I think that's what's important. But at the same time, Vandish fled from the torturous new blacksmith to go and prove his innocence. So that, to me, says that he doesn't necessarily follow the law all the time. He follows justice rather than the law. And what he sees as justice is what he calls the right thing to do. So those are his values. He follows his own moral compass as to what is the right thing to do. And when he doesn't know what the right thing is to do, I think he'll often take the path that takes him away from that situation so that he can reflect upon it and come up with a different action. But I think he always takes action. I don't think he's one of those who is inactive. And so when we combine the values with the attitude and the goals, we get this very, very, very complex character, even from a very simple process. The concept led to us developing the character. That development gave us the statistics for the character, as well as the character class and the equipment that came with that character, and the values and goals and attitudes of the character came to life, bringing us this very complex, very interesting fighter who uses a maul, who has a flute and plays music around the campfire, and is a very focused and passionate young person who follows their own moral compass and has a backstory that requires them to go on this quest to find the forge hammer, and I think more importantly to find their dog, as well as to get the approval of their father. That's my thoughts, very briefly, in 27 minutes, on how to create a character from nothing. How to just do this very simply. Does this mean that all of my other videos on character creation are redundant? Not in the slightest. We all approach character creation in different ways. This is just one of them. It's really an extension of a lot of the videos that I've been talking about in the past, or a condensation, if you like, whereas the previous videos expand on each of those ideas, develop it further, and take you on a much, much more complex journey as you answer more and more questions about the character. There's lots to Vandish the Black that we don't know about. Their parents, the mother, did she disown him as well, or is she waiting patiently for him at home? What are his flaws? What are his bonds? What are his ideals? Well, those have started to emerge. Now it's a case of aligning those to the character concept as well. And that's easily done. The bond might be that he still sends money back to his mother because the father, once disowning him, died or did not die, or is no longer supporting the mother because the mother supported him. Those things can be developed and fleshed out as you go along. But for now, we have a character that works really, really well and is fairly rounded. I hope you liked this video. If you did, hit that like button. If you want to help support the channel, hit the subscribe button and share us on any of your social media platforms so more people can join us. If you haven't heard, look below at the link for Discord, our Discord server. It's huge. There's almost 1,000 people there now, and the conversations are ranging from helping first-time people to people who've never even played the game to veterans discussing ancient old campaigns and comparing character stats. It really is a coming together of everyone who is like-minded and enjoys this channel, and it's really something to participate in. And it's 24 hours a day. There's always someone on talking about something, particularly food. That's a personal in-joke amongst the Discordites. Anyway, to you I offer this one word: interest. If you're interested in your character, you will play your character. If you're not interested in your character, you won't really want to continue. If this story doesn't work for you, chuck it out. Try again. Throw out some other random things. But don't try and overcomplicate it before you start. Interest. That's all that's going to happen. And you're only going to find that interest once you've done the concept and the development. Don't do the stats unless you really are interested in the character. Until next time then, I wish you and yours the happiest